The morning Grant Keller realized his well had gone completely dry was the same morning he discovered he had exactly $4.32 to his name, a dying vegetable patch, and too much stubborn pride to ask a single soul in Callaway Creek for help. He stood at the edge of that crumbling stone circle, rope dangling slack over the wooden beam, bucket coming up with nothing but damp air and the faint smell of mineral dust. The sun was barely cresting the low ridge to the east, painting the Texas sky in shades of burnt copper and pale gold, and already the heat was pressing down on the land like a hand. He lowered the bucket again. Again it came up empty. He dropped it a third time, slower, listening for the faint splash that had always greeted him before, and heard only the hollow knock of wood against stone somewhere far below. "Damn," he said quietly, to no one but the dry wind. Grant Keller was 31 years old, 6 feet and 1 inch of lean, sun-darkened muscle, with dark brown hair that needed cutting badly and jaw that needed shaving just as much. He had worked this land for 8 years, since he had bought it from old Hector Gaines for $200 and a promise to fence the south pasture. 12 acres. Not a grand spread by any measure, especially not in the Texas Hill Country in the summer of 1878, where men with 1,000 acres and 10 cowboys to drive their cattle still went broke by October. But 12 acres was his. Every scorched blade of grass, every stubborn cedar, every flat limestone shelf baking under the relentless sky. His. The well was the heart of it. Without that well, the kitchen garden behind the house would die within a week. The 2 horses in the small corral would have to be sold or moved. The dozen or so chickens he kept for eggs and occasional meat would scatter. And Grant Keller himself would have to pack what little remained in that 3-room house and ride into Callaway Creek with his hat in his hands, asking Harlan Pruitt at the bank for an extension on the note he already owed, telling the whole town he had failed. He was not going to do that. He picked up his hat from the post where he had hung it, settled it over his unwashed hair, and walked back to the house to think. The town of Callaway Creek sat about 4 miles east along a rutted wagon road that turned to deep mud every time the creek flooded, and to choking white dust every time it did not. Population was somewhere near 300 if you counted the families scattered on the surrounding ranches, which most people did not bother to count because they rarely came in. The town had a general store run by Mabel Hutchins, who knew everything that happened within 20 miles and made no secret of it. There was a saloon called the Red Mare, a livery, a small church that the Reverend Aldous Fitch tried to keep respectable, a 1-room schoolhouse, a doctor who was also the barber, and since February of that year, a new business on the south end of Main Street that had caused more conversation over supper tables than anything since the cattle drive of 1874 flooded the Main Street with longhorns. The sign above the door read, "DDONNELLY, well drilling and water WORKS fair prices." It had appeared one cold morning in late February, and by noon the entire town had walked past it at least twice. Mabel Hutchins had declared it peculiar. Reverend Fitch had said nothing, which said everything. Tom Warder at the Red Mare had laughed so hard he choked on his whiskey. And Grant Keller, who had ridden into town that day for flour and salt, had looked at the sign for a long moment, said nothing, gotten back on his horse and ridden home. He had not thought about it much since then. He had thought about it now. Delia Donnelly had come to Callaway Creek in January of 1878 with a wagon loaded with drilling equipment, a mule named Archibald who had the temperament of a disappointed schoolteacher, and a reputation she had built across 3 counties in central Texas for finding water where other men swore none existed. She was 27 years old, with dark red hair she kept pinned under a wide-brimmed hat most of the time, pale green eyes that missed very little, and hands that were calloused and capable in a way that made some people uncomfortable and others quietly respectful. She was the daughter of Patrick Donnelly, who had been the best well driller in Bixar County, until a cave-in took his life when Delia was 22. She had finished that well herself, hauled the equipment out, mourned her father on a Sunday, and been back to work on Monday. That was the kind of woman she was. She had learned the trade alongside her father since she was old enough to carry a hand tool. She understood limestone strata, knew how to read the way land folded itself over underground water, could calculate depth and casing, and the weight of a percussion drill with the ease of someone who had been doing it half her life, because she had. When she set up in Callaway Creek, she chose it because the hill country had more need of reliable water than any place she had worked, and because she had a feeling about the limestone formations she had seen riding in. Good water country, she had thought, if a person knew where to look. The trouble was that the men of Callaway Creek and the men on the surrounding ranches mostly did not want to know that a woman knew where to look. They nodded politely sometimes. They walked away mostly. A few had hired her already. Old Marcus Webb had paid her $60 to drill a new well on his sheep operation up near the ridge, and she had hit good water at 42 feet, just where she said she would. Word was spreading, but slowly, the way things spread in small Texas towns, carried by women who talked to other women and by old men who no longer cared about propriety. Grant Keller was neither of those things, and he spent 3 days trying to solve the problem of his well himself before he accepted that he could not. He spent the first day pulling up the old stone casing by hand, rock by rock, lowering himself on a rope to look at the bottom. What he found was what he had feared: the water table had dropped. The summer had been brutally dry, following 2 dry winters, and the underground seam that had fed his well for 8 years had retreated deeper into the limestone. The well needed to go deeper, or it needed to be abandoned, and a new one sunk entirely. Grant had neither the equipment nor the knowledge for either. He had a strong back, a good rope, and very little else. The second day he spent trying to figure out the finances. He had the $4.32, and he had a mare named Calla that he could sell for maybe $40 to the Hankins family if they were still looking. That would give him enough to hire a hand and maybe buy a basic drill, except that the drill alone would cost more than 3 times what he had, and the knowledge of how to use it was not something you picked up by reading the almanac. The third day he sat on his porch in the evening and watched his kitchen garden wilting in the dust, the bean plants going pale and papery at the edges, the tomatoes already abandoning their fruit before it could ripen, and he had a long, honest conversation with himself that was not comfortable but was necessary. He rode into Callaway Creek the following morning. He told himself he was going for supplies. He needed flour anyway, and some lamp oil. He could stop at the general store first, talk to Mabel, hear the ordinary business of the town, and then, if it seemed reasonable, perhaps walk down to the south end of Main Street and ask about rates. Casually. The way a man asks about the price of lumber, without any feeling attached to it. He was not prepared for Delia Donnelly to be the first person he saw when he came around the bend in the road. She was in the middle of the street, which was not unusual for Main Street in Callaway Creek, since the street was wide enough to drive 3 wagons abreast. What was unusual was that she had a length of rope attached to a steel percussion bit that she was examining with great focus, crouched down in the dust, turning it in her hands, looking at the cutting edge the way a surgeon looks at a blade. Her mule Archibald stood nearby, tied to her wagon, watching her with his characteristic expression of mild contempt. Her hat was pushed back on her head, and the morning sun caught the red in her hair, and she looked up when she heard Grant's horse and met his eyes without any shyness or apology. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he said, and rode past to the livery. He tied his horse, walked to the general store, bought his flour and his lamp oil from Mabel, who told him 3 things he had not asked to know about a family argument the Warrens were having over a fence line, and 2 things about a possible railroad spur that was coming through Harmon County. He nodded at appropriate intervals, paid, carried his goods back to his saddlebags, and stood in the street for a moment looking south. There was no one else he could ask. That was the plain truth of it. The man who had drilled his original well was dead. There was no other driller within 40 miles, and a well was not a fence or a roof. It was not something a determined man could simply figure out by stubbornness and looking at the problem long enough. It required specific knowledge and specific equipment, and Delia Donnelly had both. He walked south. Her door was open. He stood in the frame for a moment, looking in. The front room of what had been a harness shop before she took it over was now a working office of sorts. A table with papers spread across it, showing geological sketches and figures. A shelf of tools along the back wall. A smaller version of the percussion drill set up on a stand for demonstration. It smelled like iron and mineral dust, and something faintly like pine resin. She was at the table, writing something in a ledger. She heard him come in and looked up, and there was that same direct gaze, level and unhurried. "Mr. Keller," she said. He was surprised she knew his name, and then supposed he should not have been, given that Mabel Hutchins existed. "Miss Donnelly," he said. He took his hat off because his mother had raised him right, and he held it and stood there for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Sit down if you like," she said, and gestured to a plain wooden chair near the table. He sat. He set his hat on his knee. He looked at the geological sketches on the table without meaning to, and she noticed him looking and turned one of them so he could see it better. "Water table surveys," she said. "I've been mapping the formations in this part of the county. It's useful to know before you drill. You map them before someone hires you. I map them because I'm interested," she said, with a simplicity that caught him off guard. She set down her pen and folded her hands on the table. She was not pretty in the way the town would have described pretty, which meant soft and decorative and careful not to take up too much space. She was striking in a way that had something to do with the clarity in her face and the steadiness of her hands, and the fact that she looked at you like she intended to understand you completely. "What can I do for you?" Grant Keller was not accustomed to getting to the point quickly when the point was embarrassing. He was the kind of man who could spend a full minute talking around a subject before he landed on it. Something about the way she was looking at him made the circling seem more ridiculous than the embarrassment. "My well's gone dry," he said. "I've got 12 acres about 4 miles west on the Gaines Road. The original well's down about 30 feet and the water table's dropped. I need it drilled deeper or a new one sunk. I don't have a lot of money." She nodded slowly. She picked up her pen and turned to a fresh page in her ledger. "How long has it been dry?" "Going on a week." "What's the soil like?" "Where the current well is situated. Limestone shelf about 2 feet down. It's on the east side of the property, closest to where the creek used to run." "Used to run," he said, with a tone that acknowledged the irony of that particular geography. Something shifted in her expression, not a smile exactly, but a kind of recognition. "Hill country limestone, good," she made a note. "Limestone holds water but in seams, and those seams can shift with drought. The water's almost certainly still there, just deeper." "What year was the original well sunk?" 1869. Hector Gaines had it done. 9 years ago. It could need to go down another 20, maybe 25 feet. Depends on what I find when I look at the rock." She looked up from the ledger. "I'd need to come out and look at the site before I can give you a price." "All right," he said. There was a brief pause. "I should tell you," she said, "that I charge the same whether the property owner is comfortable with me or not. I've worked for men who thought it was irregular and men who didn't, and the water comes in either way." Grant looked at her for a moment. He felt a slight heat in his face that was not entirely the day's warmth. "I haven't said a word about irregular." "No," she agreed. "You haven't. I just find it's better to say it early." "Fair enough," he said. "When can you come?" She looked at her ledger again, checking something. "Day after tomorrow. I have a job finishing up tomorrow morning. I can be out to your place by midday." "I'll be there," he said. He stood, put his hat on, and then, because he was the kind of man his mother had raised, he said, "I appreciate it, Miss Donnelly, truly." She looked up at him with those pale green eyes, and there was something in her expression that was thoughtful and warm all at once, gone quickly behind her professional manner. I'll see you day after tomorrow, Mr. Keller. He rode home with flour and lamp oil, and the sense that something had shifted in the world, though he could not have said precisely what. He spent the following day and a half doing what he could to keep things going. He hauled water from the shallow creek bed a mile south, which yielded maybe a quarter of what he needed and smelled like mud and was not suitable for drinking without boiling. He watered the horses, the chickens, the most vital parts of the garden, and told himself it was temporary. He patched a section of fence that had been nagging at him since spring. He split firewood he did not need yet, because it was better to work than to sit and think. He thought anyway. He thought about the Keller land, which had not always been 12 acres. His father had owned 60 acres over in Edwards County before the drought of 1867, and a bank debt had reduced it to nothing. Grant had watched that happen from the age of 19 to 21, watched his father's face go from weathered to aged in the space of 2 years, watched his mother's careful household economics become desperate and then useless. When his father died in 1871, there was nothing left to inherit but the lesson, and Grant had taken that lesson seriously. He had saved every dollar for 3 years, working drives and odd labor across the hill country, until he had enough to buy the 12 acres from Hector Gaines. He had told himself he would never owe more than he could pay. He had told himself the land would not beat him. He had built the house with his own hands, repaired the well casing himself, planted and replanted the garden across the seasons, learned what the land would give and what it would withhold. The land was withholding now, and it made something burn in his chest that was older than the current problem. He was at the well when she arrived, standing on the rim and looking down into the darkness with a lantern, taking measurements. He heard the wagon before he saw it, the creak of wheels and the distinctive plodding of a mule with opinions, and he straightened up and pushed his hat back. Delia Donnelly drove with the ease of someone who had driven a loaded wagon across rough country for years. She sat straight on the seat, one hand loose on the reins, and she was looking at his property with an expression of professional assessment that he found himself curious about. She took in the house, the garden, the slope of the land eastward toward the dry creek bed, the line of cedar along the property's edge, the quality of the soil where the dust had settled on the rocks. She was reading the land the way he had seen surveyors read a map. She pulled the wagon up near the well and climbed down with the practiced efficiency of someone who did not think about climbing down from wagons, because she had done it 10,000 times. She was wearing canvas trousers and a work shirt which he had expected based on what he had heard about her, and she carried a leather satchel of tools. "Mr. Keller," she said. "Miss Donnelly." He stepped back from the well. "Here it is." She came to the rim and looked in, then crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the stone casing, feeling the rock. She pulled a short iron rod from her satchel and tapped it against different sections of the casing, listening. Then she stood and looked at the land around the well, at the slope, the direction of the limestone shelf, the pale patch of ground where the old creek run had been. "How deep did you say?" she asked. 30 feet, near enough. She nodded slowly, still looking at the ground. She walked 20 paces east, then 15 paces south, crouching once to press her hand to the earth, picking up a handful of dust and rubbing it between her fingers, looking at the color of it. He watched her do all of this and said nothing because it was clear she was working. "The seam's still there," she said finally, coming back to him. "It's just dropped. Maybe another 20 feet, maybe 25. But this location is good. You have the right geology for a reliable well. The limestone layers here run horizontal, which means water collects in them rather than draining away." She looked at him directly. "You were lucky when Gaines put this here, or he knew what he was doing." "Old Hector knew land," Grant said. "The casing's in decent shape too," she said. "We can deepen it rather than sink a new one. That'll cost less." She named a figure. It was more than he had and less than he had feared. She must have seen something in his face because she added, without making it seem charitable, "I can do half now and half when the water comes in. That's how I do it with most jobs." "That's fair," he said. He meant it fully. She looked at the well once more and then looked at him. "I'll need 2 days, maybe 3 if the rock is stubborn. I'll bring the equipment tomorrow morning and start then. You shouldn't need to do much except stay out of my way." He almost smiled. "I can manage that." "Some people can't," she said, and there was dry humor in it, not unkind. She left the drill bit she had been carrying in her wagon and took the measurements she needed, writing everything in her small notebook with a stubby pencil, and then she drove away in the direction of town. Grant stood in the yard long after the sound of the wagon had faded, looking at the dry well, and he felt, for the first time in 10 days, something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it. She came back the following morning with the full rig, a larger wagon loaded with the percussion drill apparatus, steel casing sections, rope, and the array of tools she needed. Archibald the mule was hitched with a companion mule she called simply Brown, because he was, and the two of them hauled the equipment with methodical patience. Grant was already up and had coffee made, and he offered her a cup when she pulled in. She accepted it without ceremony, drank it standing beside the wagon while she looked at the well, and handed the cup back. "Thank you," she said, and got to work. He had planned to occupy himself with the fence work, staying at a distance as instructed. He lasted about 20 minutes before he found himself drifting closer, drawn not by distrust, but by genuine fascination. He had never watched someone drill before. The percussion drilling method she used was a process of repetitive impact. The heavy steel bit dropped on its rope repeatedly, breaking the rock an inch at a time. The cuttings lifted out with a baler, progress measured in feet that accumulated slowly and demanded steady, patient attention. Delia managed the whole operation with a calm economy of movement that spoke of long practice. She had rigged the rig so that the mules did the heavy lifting on the upstroke, and she controlled the drop herself, reading the sound and feel of the bit hitting rock with the sensitivity of a woman who understood what the earth was telling her. "You can watch if you don't ask 10 questions while I'm listening," she said, without looking up, about the time he had been standing there for 5 minutes. "1 question," he said. She did glance up then, briefly. "1. How do you know when you've hit it?" "Sound changes," she said. "The bit sounds different in wet rock than dry rock. And the cuttings change too, they come up darker, and if you're close, there'll be moisture in them before the water actually comes in." She paused to drop the bit again, listening to the impact. "You'll know. It sounds different from everything that came before it." He did not ask any more questions that morning. He brought her water from the creek stock he had boiled and left it near the rig where she could reach it without stopping. He went about his work on the fence, on the garden, on the small repairs that a property always needed, and he kept his distance from the well. But he was aware of her all day in a way that was not disturbance exactly, but was something he noticed. She stopped around midday and ate the food she had brought, bread and hard cheese, and something wrapped in a cloth that turned out to be dried apple, and he came and sat nearby on a fence post with his own lunch, which was slightly more elaborate only because he had cooked that morning with the last of his good flour. He had made extra without thinking about it much. "Have some of this," he said, holding out a piece of cornbread wrapped in a cloth. She looked at it and then at him with an expression he could not fully read. Then she took it. "Thank you." They ate in a quiet that was not uncomfortable. The wind moved through the cedar trees at the property's edge, and somewhere to the west a meadowlark was singing, and the sky above them was enormous and pale blue and relentlessly clear in the way of a Texas summer sky that has not seen rain in 8 weeks. "Where are you from originally?" he asked. "Bixar County," she said. "San Antonio. My father drilled wells all over the south part of the county. I grew up following him around job sites." "Your father teach you the trade?" "He taught me everything there is to know about drilling and then some." There was something quiet in her voice when she said it, not sad exactly, but settled, the way grief becomes when it has been carried for years and has worn itself into the shape of the person carrying it. "He died 5 years ago. Cave-in." She said it plainly without asking for anything. "I finished the job and kept going." Grant was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land. "My father lost his land," he said. "It's a different kind of gone, but I watched it happen." She looked at him then with a fullness of attention. "Is that why you're here, the 12 acres?" "Something like that," he said. They finished their lunch, and she went back to the well and he went back to the fence, and neither of them said anything more about fathers or land or the things a person carries. But something had shifted between them, the way the air shifts just before a weather change, imperceptibly, but you know it when you breathe it. By the end of the first day she had gone down 11 feet. She covered the rig for the night and unhitched the mules, turning Archibald and Brown into Grant's corral with his 2 horses. There was a brief diplomatic incident in which Archibald communicated his views about the horses in no uncertain terms, but it sorted itself out by evening. "You're welcome to supper," Grant said, before he had fully thought through whether he should say it. She looked at the sky, at the distance of the ride back to town, at something in her own mind. "All right," she said. He cooked with what he had, which was not much beans with salt pork, some of the garden vegetables that had not yet given up, corn cake. She sat at his table without making any particular comment about the plainness of the house or the sparseness of the meal, and she ate with the appetite of a woman who had worked hard all day and was hungry without apology. He liked that about her very much, though he did not say so. They talked about Callaway Creek, about the country, about the drought, and what it was doing to the ranches east of the ridge. She knew things about the land he had not known, the way the underground water systems of the hill country connected, the old Spanish wells she had found while surveying that dated back to before Texas statehood, the relationship between the cedar growth and the water table that she explained in plain terms that made immediate sense to him. "Cedar drinks an enormous amount of water," she said. "A full-grown cedar can take in 30 gallons a day from the soil. People plant them for windbreaks without thinking about what they're doing to the water table underneath." He looked at the line of cedar at his property's east edge. "Those have been there longer than the well. I know. They're probably contributing to the problem, though the drought is the main cause." She looked at her hands, which she had washed but which still showed the marks of the day's work. "You might consider clearing a few of the nearest ones in the fall." "I'll think on it," he said. She left as the sun was going down, riding Brown back to town and promising to be back at dawn with Archibald and the rig. He stood at the edge of the yard and watched her go, and the evening was very quiet around him, and he was aware that the quiet was a different quality than it had been before she came. The second day she went down 16 more feet, through a particularly stubborn layer of rock that required longer drops and more patient attention. He worked near enough to help when she needed an extra hand on the rope, and she was direct and unpretentious about directing him, telling him clearly what she needed without either over-explaining or under-explaining. He found it easy to work with her. She did not perform competence, she simply had it. In the afternoon she said, "Tell me about this property." "What were your plans for it?" He looked at the 12 acres as if seeing them from outside for a moment. "Horses, mostly. I had a plan to raise cutting horses, good working stock for the ranches. I've got 2 good mares. I bred one last spring." He paused. "Without reliable water it doesn't work. Horses drink more than you'd think." "They drink more than you think," she agreed. "A working horse will take 10 to 12 gallons a day in this heat." She looked at his 2 mares in the corral. "They're good horses, the bay especially. Look at the depth through her chest." "That's Calla," he said. "I was going to sell her." Something in his voice must have conveyed what that meant, because Delia looked at him briefly. "You won't need to," she said, not as comfort but as professional confidence. "The water is there." She was right. On the morning of the third day, at 54 feet, the character of the bit sound changed. He heard it from 20 feet away, a subtle shift from the dry knock of the percussion drill into something marginally duller, softer in its resonance, and he looked up from the cedar post he was stripping and watched her. She pulled the baler up, and the cuttings came out dark and wet, sticking together in a clump that fell apart with the weight of moisture. She looked at it and then looked at him with an expression that was contained but warm, the way a person looks when they have done something they are genuinely proud of. "There it is," she said. He crossed the yard and crouched beside her, looking at the dark, wet cuttings in the sun. He reached out and touched them, and the moisture on his finger was real and cool. "How long?" he asked. "Another hour to seat the lower casing. The water will fill in overnight. By morning you'll have a proper well." She sat back on her heels and looked at him, and there was something in that moment, the sun on the dry dust around them, the smell of wet limestone coming up from the earth, the fact that something that had been broken was about to be whole, that neither of them entirely looked away from. "Miss Donnelly," he said. "Delia," she said. "I think we can manage first names by now." "Delia," he said it carefully. "I don't have the words to properly thank you." "The second half of the payment will do," she said, and smiled. And it was the first full smile he had seen from her, quick and genuine and transforming, and he felt it somewhere in the center of his chest like the sound of water in dry rock. She finished seating the lower casing, lowered the new galvanized pipe he had bought that morning from Hutchins' store after she had told him what to get, and by midday the well was set to fill. She cleaned and packed her equipment with the same methodical efficiency with which she had arrived, loading the wagon with Archibald's considerable help. Grant went inside and counted out what remained of his money, added to it what he had retrieved from the tin under his floorboard where he kept the real savings, and brought it out to her. She counted it without embarrassment, found it correct, and put it in her coat pocket. Then she looked at the well and at his property, and she looked at him. "The water will be good," she said. "Come check it tomorrow morning. If there's any issue with the casing seat, I want to know." "There won't be," he said. "You know what you're doing." She looked at him with an expression he did not entirely understand but could not stop thinking about. "Thank you, Grant," she said. It was the first time she had said his name, and the way she said it was simple and deliberate, as if she had decided to. He helped her hitch Archibald to the wagon. They were standing close together in the necessary business of adjusting the harness, and she smelled like the work of the day, iron and stone dust and clean sweat, and something else underneath that was simply her, and he was very aware of her hands working the buckle beside his. "I would like," he said, and then stopped. She looked up at him. The brim of her hat was tilted back, and her eyes were level with his chin, and she was waiting with that quality of full attention she had. "I would like to take you to supper in town," he said. "Not as payment and not as further business, just supper." She was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough for him to feel the risk he had taken in asking. Then she said, "Saturday." "Saturday," he agreed. She drove away in the long afternoon light, and he stood in his yard beside his repaired and refilling well, and he could hear the far meadowlark again, and the 12 acres felt entirely different than they had 2 weeks ago, and he could not account for all the reasons. He checked the well at dawn on Friday. He lowered the bucket on the new rope, and it came up heavy and full, the water cold and clean and smelling of limestone and depth, and he drank a cupful standing right there with water running down his chin, and did not feel a bit undignified about it. He spent Saturday morning in preparations that he would have denied were preparations to anyone who asked. He mended the collar of his better shirt. He shaved properly, with hot water and care. He put on his good belt with the plain silver buckle his father had left him, and his second-best hat, which was in better shape than the working one. He rode Calla to town because she had a better pace than his gelding, and he arrived at the main street of Callaway Creek at the agreed hour of 6 in the evening, when the worst of the heat had retreated and the light was going golden over the rooftops. Delia was waiting outside her shop, and he caught his breath without being entirely ready for it. She had her red hair down from its working pins, and it was striking thick and dark red in the evening light, and she was wearing a dress of dark green cotton that was plain and well-made, and suited her in a way that the canvas trousers also suited her, which was to say completely and without effort. She was not wearing her work hat. She looked up when she heard Calla, and she smiled, and it was the same quick, genuine smile as before, but without any professional containment in it, and he thought for a moment that he was in considerable trouble. He dismounted and tied Calla and came to meet her, and he said, "You look lovely." She looked briefly startled, as if she had not expected that directness. Then she said, "Thank you. You look considerably cleaner than usual." He laughed and she laughed, and they walked to the small eating house that Mrs. Garza ran 3 evenings a week beside the livery. It was the only establishment in Callaway Creek that could properly be called a restaurant, and Mrs. Garza cooked Central Texas ranch food with a skill and attention that made even the plainest meal memorable. She gave them a table by the window without comment, and her expression when she saw them together was simply pleased. The way women of a certain practical wisdom are pleased when two people they have noticed separately appear together for reasons they find entirely logical. They ate tamales and beef in red chili sauce and fresh tortillas that Mrs. Garza brought hot to the table, and they talked the way people talk when they have found that they can, easily and without effort, moving through subjects like the recent news from the territories to the north, where tension between settlers and the Comanche had not fully resolved despite the treaties, to the question of whether the railroad would actually come through Harmon County as rumored, to Grant's plans for his horse operation now that the water situation was resolved, to Delia's work and where it had taken her before she came to Callaway Creek. "I worked a job in the Pecos country the summer before last," she said, "ranch near Fort Stockton." The family had been hauling water in barrels for 2 years by the time they called me. 2 years, she shook her head. "The water was there at 60 feet. It's always there somewhere if you know how to look." "Is that why you do it?" he asked. "Because you can find it." She considered the question seriously, in the way she considered most things. "Partly," she said, "and partly because my father did it and I loved being beside him when he worked, and partly because it's necessary work, real work. The land out here is hard. People come out here with everything they have and try to build something, and the one thing that can end all of it is water, or the lack of it." She looked at him with a candor that felt very personal. "People like you, 12 acres and a plan and everything on the line. I like knowing I could be the thing that makes it possible." Grant was quiet for a moment, turning his water glass in his hands. "That is exactly what you were," he said. She looked at the table, then back at him. "I know what it costs," she said quietly, "asking for help when you're the kind of person who doesn't ask easily." He looked at her steadily. "How do you know I'm that kind?" "Because you waited 3 days to come to town after your well went dry," she said. "Mabel Hutchins told me you bought supplies and walked past my door and rode home." He felt the warmth in his face. "Mabel," he said. "Mabel," Delia agreed, with that dry warmth that was becoming familiar to him. "Was she wrong?" he said. "No," she said. "She wasn't wrong." Outside, the street was settling into evening, the last of the sunlight going amber above the storefronts, a couple of riders coming in at a slow walk with the dust of the day on their clothes, the sound of a guitar starting somewhere down at the Red Mare. It was a scene so ordinary and so much itself. The small town, the summer evening, the smell of dust and supper, that it seemed to Grant both completely unremarkable and entirely significant. "I'd like to walk," he said. "If you're not needed back directly." "I'm not needed back," she said. They walked along the edge of town where the road went south toward the creek, in the cooling evening air that smelled of dried grass and cedar, and the particular clean smell of the hill country after a day without rain, which was most days. They were not touching, but they walked close enough that the space between them felt intentional, the way a pause in music is intentional, carrying as much weight as the notes. "You said you'd thought about horses," she said. "Cutting horses. What does that mean to you, really? Not the business of it." No one had ever asked him that before, not quite in that way. Not separating the dream from the business, he thought about it honestly. "I grew up around horses in a way that was just, they were always there and I was always watching them, the way they think, the way they move with cattle. A good cutting horse is something else entirely. They understand the work. You can feel it when you're on one, when the horse is engaged and thinking, when it's real partnership." He paused. "I had a horse like that once on a drive up in the Concho country. Couldn't afford to buy her, but I worked her for 6 months. She knew what I was going to ask before I asked it. I've been trying to find that again ever since." Delia was listening with the whole of herself, and he was aware that she was, and it made him more honest than he might otherwise have been. "Keller's foal will be here in the fall," he said. "If it's right, that'll be the start." "What do you need besides the water?" she said. "To make it work," he thought about it. "Another good mare would help. Better fencing on the north pasture, which is in sorry shape. Time. It takes years to build a reputation for horses." He looked at the sky, at the stars beginning to appear in the blue dark above. "And probably someone to tell me I'm not being ridiculous about it." "You're not being ridiculous," she said, and she said it with a flatness that was not dismissive but was curt, the way she said things when she meant them completely. He stopped walking and looked at her. She had stopped too. They were at the edge of town where the road bent south, with the cedar dark against the sky and the first night insects beginning to sing, and the town's lamplight faint behind them. "Delia," he said. She looked at him with those clear pale eyes that saw very well in the dark. He reached out and very carefully, giving her every chance to step back, put his hand against the side of her face. She did not step back. She looked at him with an expression that was open and considered and honest, and she leaned the smallest amount into his hand, and he kissed her once with care and seriousness, and it was entirely different from everything that had come before it and entirely of a piece with all of it. When they stepped back, she was looking at him steadily, and she said, "I should tell you that I'm not easy to know." "I've noticed that," he said, "and it doesn't concern me in the least." She smiled, and he had the sense that this smile was rarer and more privately given than the others, and he held that carefully. He rode home that night in the full dark, and the land was silver under the moon, and when he checked the well at the barn, habit, not necessity. The water was cold and real and present, and the 12 acres felt like something that was beginning rather than something that was barely surviving. In the weeks that followed, Delia Donnelly drove out to the Keller property more frequently than any professional obligation required. She had told herself the first time that she needed to check the well casing after 2 weeks, which was true, but not the reason. The second time she brought him geological charts she had drawn of the surrounding property, showing where a second well might eventually be useful if he expanded the horse operation north. The third time she brought nothing at all except Archibald, who seemed to feel comfortable in the Keller corral by now, and she arrived on a Sunday when the heat was at its most insistent and the hill country shimmered under it, and Grant had been working on the north fence all morning and was streaked with sweat and sawdust when she drove in. He saw her and grinned, which was something his face had been doing with increasing frequency lately. "Sunday," he said. "Sunday," she agreed. "I'm not working." "Neither are you, starting now." He left the fence posts where they were and went to wash at the trough. She unhitched Archibald and put him in the corral with her practiced ease, and he came around the corner of the barn to find her sitting on the fence rail watching the horses with an expression of genuine pleasure. "Keller's moving well," she said. "Getting closer," he said, looking at the mare. "August, I think, maybe September." He brought 2 cups of water from the new well, and they sat on the porch in the shade of the overhang, and the afternoon moved around them slowly. He had begun to understand in those weeks what she had meant when she said she was not easy to know. She was not closed, she was forthright and clear, and did not play at mystery for its own sake. But there were depths in her that opened slowly and required patience, and what he found there when they did open was richer and more particular than what most people showed you early. She thought in long, careful lines. She remembered details with precision. She had opinions about things she had considered seriously and very little opinion about things she had not considered at all. She was funny, in a way that came out dry and sideways, and caught him off guard in the best possible way. He was entirely and irretrievably in love with her by the middle of August, a fact he arrived at one morning while splitting wood, not gradually or with much drama, but with the specific clarity of a man who has been looking at something from the corner of his eye for weeks and finally turns to look at it directly. He stood with the axe and looked at the fact of it, and then set the axe down and thought about what to do with it. He was not going to rush. He had been patient about this land, about this life, about everything he had built here, and that patience had served him well. But he also knew himself well enough to know that patience was not the same as indefinite delay. The day he decided to tell her, the weather intervened. He had ridden into town that afternoon with the specific intention of asking her to supper again and then, in some context that felt right, telling her the truth of what he felt. He arrived on Main Street to find the sky to the south had gone the particular flat greenish-yellow that in the hill country means serious weather, and the wind had come up hard and fast off the ridge, the kind of wind that bends the cedar and doesn't stop. Mabel Hutchins was standing in her doorway looking at the sky with an expression of concerned evaluation. Several men were already tying down their horses with extra care. He found Delia outside her shop, wrestling a canvas tarp over the rig she had left in the street, which she had apparently been in the middle of loading for a job the following day. The wind was making the canvas a living argument. He dismounted and grabbed the near corner of the tarp without being asked. Together they folded it down and secured it, and she handed him the rope end, and he tied it around the wheel spoke while she got the other side. The rain started before they were done, coming in fast and sideways, the kind of hill country thunderstorm that dropped 2 inches in an hour and made up for the entire summer's absence in one violent evening. They got inside her shop and she pulled the door closed against the wind, and they stood just inside, both of them wet and breathing hard from the effort, and the rain drummed on the roof above them with tremendous authority. Somewhere outside there was lightning, and then the thunder, close and deep. In the lamplight of her shop, with the rain coming down and the world contracted to this one small warm space, she laughed. It came out sudden and genuine, a real laugh at the absurdity of the soaking and the wind and the tarp, and he laughed too, and they stood there in the storm laughing, and then the laughter settled and they were standing close and looking at each other, and something in the air was different from all the other moments. "Delia," he said. She was already looking at him with that full attention, rain-wet and perfectly herself. "I love you," he said. It came out straightforward, without flourish, the way he said things he meant completely. "I want you to know that clearly, without any uncertainty about what I mean." She was quiet for a moment that he held onto with both hands, waiting. "I know," she said, and her voice was different, softer and more private than her ordinary voice, the one she kept for work and public life. "I've known for a while." She reached out and put her hand against the front of his wet shirt. "I love you too, Grant. That's also very clear to me." He put both his arms around her and held her in the small, warm, lamplit room, while the Texas summer stormed through itself against the walls outside, and she put her arms around him and her face against his shoulder, and it was the simplest and most complete thing that had happened to him in years. The rain lasted 3 hours. They spent it talking, really talking, in the way that people talk when a threshold has been crossed, and there is no longer any reason to be careful about what is revealed. She told him about the years after her father died, the loneliness of it, the determination that covered the loneliness, the way she had built her competence and her reputation as a kind of fortress and a kind of purpose, and how neither of those things was wrong exactly, but how they were not sufficient. He told her about his father's land, the full story, the particular grief of watching a man lose the thing he had defined himself by, and how that grief had informed everything he had done since, the fierce independence, the refusal to ask for help, the long, careful building of 12 acres into something solid. "It almost cost you the land," she said gently, "the pride." "It almost cost me everything," he said. He looked at her. "If I had let it, I would never have come to you." "Mabel Hutchins would have sent you eventually," she said, and there was the dry humor, but under it was something warm and honest. "I don't want to think about that," he said, and she laughed again, and he loved the sound of it. When the rain stopped, the world outside was clean and smelled of wet cedar and washed limestone, and the moon was coming out between the last of the clouds, enormous and white over the hill country. He rode home on Keller through roads that were soft with rain, and the land on either side was silver and wet. and the well when he passed it had collected 2 inches of water in the stone rim above ground, clean rain sitting in the sunken hollow, and he thought that the hill country had a way of reminding you, on its own schedule and in its own language, that what you needed was there. He asked her to marry him on the porch of his house on an October evening, the day Calla's foal was born. They had been there together all morning and afternoon, attending the foaling with the particular attention of people who understand what it means for the animal and for the future. Calla was a good, calm mare, and the foal came in the early afternoon, a bay colt, strong and correct, with a white mark on his nose like a thumbprint. Grant had named him Reason, because he had been telling himself to be reasonable about his hopes, and now here was something that exceeded them. He was sitting on the porch steps in the evening with Delia beside him, the October air cool and sweet after the brutal summer, the sky going purple and orange over the ridge, the colt standing steadily in the corral on his new legs, Calla moving quietly beside him. He had the ring in his shirt pocket. He had bought it in San Antonio 3 weeks earlier, riding the 40 miles there and back in a single long day without telling anyone what he was doing. It was a plain gold band with a small dark green stone, and when he had seen it in the jeweler's case, he had thought of her eyes immediately and without question. He took it out and he looked at it for a moment in the evening light, and he said, "Delia." She turned to look at him, and she saw the ring, and her expression went through several things in rapid succession: surprise, recognition, and then something quiet and settled and absolutely sure. "I know I haven't got much to offer on paper," he said. 12 acres and a working well and a bay colt and a lot of plans that are still in the process of becoming real. But I can offer you certainty, the kind of certain I am about this land, about this work, about the things I have decided to believe in. He looked at her steadily. "I want to build this life with you. I want you beside me on this porch and at this table and in all the work and all the years. I love you more than I know how to say properly, and I have tried to say it properly in my head a number of times." She was looking at him with her eyes bright in the evening light, and she said, "You just did say it properly." "Delia Donnelly," he said, "will you marry me?" She took the ring from his hand and looked at it and then looked at him, and the certainty in her face was the same certainty he had seen when she told him the water was there at 54 feet, the certainty of a person who knows what the earth is telling them. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Grant." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it in the fading light, and then she looked at him, and he kissed her in the cool October evening with the last of the sunset behind them, and the foal standing in the corral, and the well full and real in the ground. And he thought that the 12 acres had never been larger than they were in that moment. They married in December at the small church in Callaway Creek, in a ceremony that Reverend Fitch performed with genuine warmth and that half the town attended, because Mabel Hutchins had been clear about the date, the time, and the expectation of attendance. Mrs. Garza brought food. Old Marcus Webb, for whom Delia had drilled her first Callaway Creek well, sat in the front row beside Mabel and nodded approving throughout. The red mare closed early as a gesture of respect that surprised everyone, including Tom Warder, who seemed surprised by it himself. Delia wore the dark green dress, and her hair was up with a sprig of dried cedar flowers that she had found herself, and she walked down the short aisle with the contained and genuine smile that Grant had come to understand meant she was feeling something too large to express otherwise. He stood at the front of the church in his good clothes with his hands clasped and his heart fully occupied, and when she reached him and he took her hand, the solid reality of her presence beside him, everything she was, the intelligence and the capability and the humor and the depth and the love she had shown him in ways both spoken and unspoken, filled him with a gratitude he could not have named on paper and did not need to. "I do," she said, looking at him directly, without ceremony in her voice but with everything in her eyes. "I do," he said, looking back at her, and meaning it with the entirety of himself. They rode home to the 12 acres that evening in a wagon Grant had cleaned and hung with a paper lantern Delia had made. Archibald hitched alongside his gelding in a partnership, the mule accepted with only minor philosophical objection. The night was cold and clear, the hill country stars extraordinarily bright above the dark cedar ridges, and Delia sat beside him with her shoulder against his and her hand in his on the seat, and they talked and laughed all the 4 miles home. The house was warm, with a fire Grant had laid that morning before riding to the church. She had brought a few things over the previous week, the geological charts and survey tools that now occupied a corner of the front room, some books, a quilt her mother had made that she had carried from San Antonio, and that she spread on the bed that night with a care he watched quietly from the doorway and understood was the laying down of one kind of life and the taking up of another. "It's a good house," she said, looking around the room. "It needs some work," he said. "Everything worth having needs some work," she said. He came and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against him, and they stood there in the warm, fire-lit room on the first night of their married life, looking at the house they would now build together. In the spring of 1879, Delia drilled 2 more wells in Harmon County, one for a sheep rancher north of the ridge, and one for a family homesteading in a new section of land east of the creek. Word of her work had spread sufficiently that she had a 3rd inquiry from a ranch in the next county, and she spent 3 days over the hill doing the site survey, while Grant stayed home with Reason, who was coming along well in his first halter work, and showing the kind of quiet intelligence in his eyes that made Grant increasingly certain about the horse's future. She came home from the survey on a Thursday evening dusty and tired and satisfied, and he had supper on the table, and she sat down and ate with the appetite that came from real work and said, "The Harmon County job will take me a week, maybe 10 days if the rock is difficult." "I'll manage," he said. She looked at him across the table with something in her expression he recognized as deliberate. "Grant," she said, "I want to tell you something." He set down his fork and gave her his full attention. "I think we're going to have a baby," she said. He was quiet for a long moment, the fire in the stove and the spring wind outside and the full, extraordinary reality of what she had just told him sitting in the room with them. "Are you certain?" he said. "Fairly certain," she said. "I've been watching it for a few weeks. I wanted to be sure before I said." He got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took her hands in his, and she looked at him with an expression that was at once matter-of-fact and deeply moved, the expression she had when something was so significant that all she could do was look at it straight. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings." She paused. "Happy, very happy." He brought her hands to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and she put her free hand on the side of his face, and they stayed like that in the kitchen while the spring evening settled outside. "The Harmon County job," she said. "We'll talk about it," he said. "There's no urgency yet. You know your limits better than anyone." "I do know my limits," she said, with a small lift to her voice that was not entirely pride but was some cousin of it. "I'm not made of glass, Grant." "I am completely aware of that," he said. She did the Harmon County job in 10 days and came home with a full payment and a new inquiry from an additional ranch, which she accepted for the fall after the baby came. She was methodical and sensible about it, the way she was methodical and sensible about most things, aware of her body's changing requirements, taking longer breaks, drinking more water, asking Grant for help on the heavier rope work without making a particular ceremony of asking, which he had come to understand was her way of managing the gap between her independence and her recognition that partnership sometimes meant letting someone else carry part of the weight. He, for his part, was learning the same lesson from the other direction, that 12 acres and a plan and a certain kind of stubbornness were not the same as the self-sufficiency he had sometimes confused them for, and that the presence of another person in the full sense, someone who was with you in the deep work as well as the surface work, made the whole enterprise more real and not less. He had thought for years that needing help was weakness. What he understood now was that it was simply the truth of how things worked, that no one did anything entirely alone, and the pretense of it had cost him more than one broken well. He told her this one evening in late summer, sitting on the porch while the heat lightened toward dusk, and she listened and then said, with that dry precision that he loved, "It only took a dry well to teach you." "It took you," he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the land. "It took both," she said honestly, and he thought she was probably right. In September of 1879, Delia gave birth to a son in the bedroom of the house on the 12 acres, attended by the doctor from Callaway Creek, who was also the barber, and by Mrs. Garza, who arrived with food and calm authority and proved more useful than either of the other two. Grant was present, because Delia had told him calmly and without argument that she wanted him there, and he was present fully, holding her hand through the hard hours and saying very little because she did not need words from him. She needed his presence, and he gave it with everything he had. The boy was healthy and fair-haired and loud in his first opinion of the world, and Grant held him that evening in the lamplight with his heart so full it was almost difficult to breathe, and looked at Delia where she lay propped against the pillows, tired and real and extraordinary, and thought that everything he had worked for and everything that had been broken and everything that had been repaired and everything that had grown from the repair was distilled somehow into this particular moment and this particular room. "What do you want to name him?" he said. She looked at the baby, then at Grant. "Patrick," she said, "for my father." Grant nodded. Patrick Donnelly had been the man who taught his daughter everything she knew about reading the earth and finding what it had to offer, and that knowledge had found its way across the miles and the years to a dry well in the hill country and to a stubborn man too proud to ask for help, and had changed everything. Patrick seemed right. "Patrick Keller," Grant said. She smiled. "Patrick Keller." Reason turned 2 in October of that year, and Grant began his cutting horse training in earnest, spending the long, cool mornings working the colt with calm patience. And the colt proved everything his birth had promised, quick and willing, with the particular quality of attention that distinguished a genuinely good cutting horse from a merely capable one. He could read a cow the way Delia read a geological formation, with an instinct that was half training and half something that could not be trained, only recognized and cultivated. Tom Warder, who kept cattle and had never thought much of Grant Keller one way or the other, came out to see the horse in November and stood at the fence for a long time watching Reason work, and then said, without looking up, "I'll give you $60 for him." Grant said he was not for sale at any price. Warder said 80. Grant said he would sell the horse's first foal at a fair price when the time came. Warder looked at Reason again for a long moment and then said all right. That was the beginning of the horse operation in a real sense, not the well, not the foal's birth, but the moment when someone outside the 12 acres saw the value of what was being built there and agreed to it. Grant told Delia that evening, and she said, $60. That's a good start. He said, "I turned down 80. She gave him a look that combined admiration and mild exasperation in equal proportion, and he felt it was an accurate assessment. The following spring Delia drilled the well at the ranch in the neighboring county, which took 12 days and went down 67 feet through particularly argumentative rock, and the payment from it allowed them to repair the north fence properly and buy the second mare Grant had been needing. He named her Thursday, for the day she arrived, and she was a dark bay with similar lines to Calla, and he had plans for her immediately. Patrick grew through that first year into a boy who was interested in everything and afraid of almost nothing, and had his mother's green eyes and his father's jaw, and the quality of watching things carefully that both of them had in their different ways, and that in Patrick seemed native, as if it had come with him rather than being learned. Delia nursed him and carried him on jobs in the early months, in a sling she had rigged with practical ingenuity, and when he was old enough to be left for a day, she left him with Mrs. Garza's family in town during the longer jobs, and Mrs. Garza's daughters competed to hold him, and he accepted this with the equanimity of a person who had been much held and knew it was reliable. By the spring of 1881, the 12 acres had changed. The house had a new room added on the east side, built over 2 weekends in February with help from Webb's hired man and from Tom Warder, who arrived unexpectedly on the second day with tools and said nothing about it except that it was coming in cold and they had better get the roof on. The north fence was straight and solid. The corral had been expanded. Reason had his first offspring, a filly out of Thursday, born in April, small and quick and serious, who was named Clara by Delia on the grounds that she looked like she had opinions. Grant accepted this without argument because it was accurate. The well had not given them trouble since the drilling. 54 feet down, in the limestone seam that Delia had found and known was there, even when the evidence above ground suggested nothing. The water was reliable and cold and present in every season. In a drought year it dropped somewhat, as all wells did, but it did not go dry. It had been put in correctly, at the right depth and in the right location, by someone who understood the land and had been willing to look at it without the shortcuts. It was Grant's habit, every morning, to draw the first bucket of the day himself. He did not know entirely when this had become a habit, only that it had, and that there was something in the daily act of letting the rope down and drawing the full weight up that connected him to the fact of what he had here. The water that made the horses possible, and the garden possible, and the house possible. The water that had required him to lay aside a pride that was doing him no good and walk 4 miles east to a woman who knew how to find what the land was offering. He thought about that sometimes on those early mornings when the sky was just getting its color, and the horses were moving in the corral, and the house behind him was quiet with the sleeping of his wife and his son. He thought about how close he had come to not asking, how close he had come to letting the thing he needed most recede into the ground while he stood over the dry hole telling himself he could solve it alone. How the cost of that pride would have been incalculable, not the water, not the horse operation, not the 12 acres, but her, Delia, the entirety of what had grown from the asking, which was more than he had known how to want before he had it. He thought about his father, too, on those mornings. His father, who had held too hard to what he had and had not reached for what he needed, and had lost both. Grant did not want to be that. He had thought for years that the lesson his father's life contained was about the land, about holding it, protecting it, never owing more than you could pay. And that was part of it. But the larger part, he understood now, was about the reaching, about the necessary acknowledgement that you could not do it alone, that the things you needed were not always the things you could produce yourself, and that asking for them was not failure but was, in fact, the exact opposite of failure. In the summer of 1881, Delia discovered she was pregnant again. She was 30 years old, and the pregnancy was uncomplicated in the early months, and she continued her work with the calibration she had learned the first time, careful but not timid, aware but not anxious. She had accepted an inquiry from a ranch 2 counties over, a large operation that needed 3 new wells across its range, and she planned to do the survey work in the fall and the drilling in the spring. 3 wells, Grant said. It's good money, she said. And the geology is interesting over there. Different formation than here. I want to see it. You want to see it, he repeated, not arguing, just recognizing her. She looked at him with those clear green eyes. I want to see it, she confirmed, and there was the straightforwardness that he had loved from the first day he sat across her table, the woman who said exactly what she meant without apology and without artifice. Patrick was 2 years old by then, walking everywhere at a determined pace and talking with an enthusiasm that did not let him wait for complete sentences. He liked the horses with an intensity that worried Grant slightly on safety grounds and delighted him on everything else. He had learned the word reason before he had learned Grant's name, a fact that Grant mentioned to Delia with a mock-wounded expression that made her laugh in the way he loved best. The fall survey trip Delia took in October, to the ranch 2 counties over, was 3 days. And Grant managed the house and Patrick and the horses alone for those 3 days, with a competence that surprised him only because he had not tried it before in exactly these terms. Patrick slept through most nights and woke early and was interested in the chickens before breakfast. And Grant discovered that a 2-year-old and a corral full of horses made for a full morning without any particular additional challenge. When Delia came home on the third evening, driving Archibald down the Gaines Road in the low autumn light, Patrick ran across the yard to meet her with his arms up, and she climbed down from the wagon and lifted him and held him against her shoulder. And Grant came out onto the porch and watched them and thought about the 12 acres and the full well and the good horses, and the house with the new room, and the woman coming across the yard holding his son. And the feeling in his chest was something for which he had never found the exactly right word, though he had tried. He came down the porch steps and met her in the yard and kissed her with Patrick between them, squirming with objection, and she laughed against his mouth. "The survey went well," she said. "The formation is beautiful. There's water everywhere over there just waiting." "Of course there is," he said. "You knew that before you went." "I suspected," she said, with the precision of someone who distinguishes between knowing and suspecting because it matters. "Now I know." He took Archibald's lead and she carried Patrick into the house, and the October evening was gold and cooling around them, the cedar dark at the property's edge, the well standing solid by the barn in the last light. Their daughter was born in March of 1882, during a late winter rainstorm that came in cold off the north and drummed the new room's roof all night. She was smaller than Patrick had been and quieter about her arrival, and she looked at the world from her first moments with an expression of thoughtful evaluation that Delia, propped against the pillows with her arm around this new child, said was either very promising or very troubling, and probably both. They named her Me, after Grant's mother, who had been a woman of quiet and formidable capability, and he thought it was a good name for this particular child. Patrick regarded his sister for 3 days with the careful consideration of someone assessing a new horse, and then on the 4th day, while she was lying on the quilt on the floor, he sat beside her and took her hand with enormous seriousness. And Grant, who was watching from the doorway, felt something so full in his throat that he had to look away at the window. Spring came to the hill country with its particular extravagance, the wildflowers coming up blue and orange and yellow across the limestone flats, the cedar putting out its pale new growth, the creek running with the March rains, and making the sound of running water that all summer Grant would remember. Clara the filly was a year old and showing everything reason had shown at her age, and Tom Warder had already spoken about her, which Grant took as evidence that the operation was building the reputation he had worked for. He sold Reason's second foal, a colt, to a ranch in Kendall County for $140, which was the most money he had ever received for a single horse, and which he and Delia celebrated by riding into Callaway Creek and eating at Mrs. Garza's establishment and drinking the good wine that Mrs. Garza produced on significant occasions from somewhere in the back room, and walking home in the clear spring night, because it was only 4 miles, and the night was too fine to spend in a wagon. He had the 12 acres and a working well and 2 good horses producing excellent foals and a daughter and a son and a wife who had walked into his half-failing life with a percussion drill and the knowledge of where to look for what the land was holding, and he thought, walking in the spring dark with her hand in his, that he had been right about 12 acres from the beginning. It was enough. It was, depending on the day and the season and the quality of the light on the limestone, considerably more than enough. "Are you happy?" she asked him once on a midsummer evening a year later, sitting on the porch in the last light with the sound of the children inside and the horses quiet in the corral, the well a dark stone circle by the barn. He thought about it, not in the way of someone who does not know the answer, but in the way of someone who wants to answer accurately. "Yes," he said. "More than I thought I'd get to be." He looked at her in the fading light, at the woman who had read the land and found the water and fixed what was broken, and then, with a patience that matched his own and a heart larger than his pride had deserved, fixed him too. "Are you?" She looked out at the 12 acres, at the working land and the full well and the good horses and the deepening dark of the hill country sky above it all. She found his hand on the porch rail and held it. "I am exactly where I would choose to be," she said. And Delia Donnelly said it with the flatness that meant certainty, the same certainty she had brought to the water at 54 feet, to the ring on her finger, to the 2 children sleeping inside, to every true thing she had found in the earth or anywhere else. The stars were coming out above them, the enormous Texas sky going dark in layers, and the well stood full in the yard, and the 12 acres breathed around them in the cooling night, and neither of them needed to say anything more. They had enough. They had, in fact, everything.